Hi, I'm Carlin Borisenko. In early 2020, I was the knitting Democrat who accidentally went viral on the internet for going to a Trump rally and then left the party. I became the conservative darling, was on all the shows, traveled around the country, and then realized that conservatives were no better than Democrats. If there's one thing that I've learned, it's that both political tribes are two sides of the same coin. But it wasn't all bad. On my journey, I became obsessed with understanding the woke ideology and the culture war. I broke the story of the city of Seattle doing segregated training with its employees.
How bad has this stuff become? The city of Seattle has now put out, I'm not kidding you, this is according to Dr. Carolyn Borisenko, who's an organizational psychologist. The city of Seattle asked its white employees to voluntarily spend a day off in a training about their internalized racial superiority.
I broke the story that led to the first ever federal lawsuit against critical race theory in the schools. I broke the Coke Be Less White story, one of the biggest anti-woke stories of all time. It got over 30 million views. Coca-Cola's corporate headquarters even had to change their outgoing voicemail.
Throughout the past few days, you may have seen inaccurate reporting on the content of our recently launched diversity, equity, and inclusion training program.
I exposed the schools in Burlington, Vermont for grooming middle school children live on the internet. They called me an unwoke cult leader for that. And the Vermont Human Rights Commission slandered me publicly as being a hate channel. I even got called a hero in Breitbart for exposing that the Washington Post was writing a hit piece on Christopher Rufo. I have broken story after story after story about what's going on in the public schools, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, to autistic sex education, to the Department of Education in Michigan, literally training teachers all over the state how to groom children. I wrote a book called Actively Unwoke, the ultimate guide for fighting back against the woke insanity in your life. I host a podcast all about fighting back, and I'm downloading all of my knowledge to you on my Substack, carlin.substack.com. The world is a crazy place. We are literally surrounded by cults on all sides. On this show, we're going to do a deep dive into all aspects of the culture war, and I will show you the dark, dystopian underbellies on both sides. Here are the commitments I'll make to you. I will always tell you the truth. I will always bring you receipts. And if you stick with me, I promise you will see the world differently. Welcome to the cult. Please mount that like button for me and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Cult. The Cult is a show that I stream Monday through Friday on this here YouTube channel, on Rumble, on Twitter, maybe some other places as well, if I feel so inclined, where we talk about all aspects of the culture war, from the farthest of the far left to the farthest of the far right. Though I have to tell you guys, the last couple weeks, dabbling in the farthest of the far right has been an interesting, dare I say, red pilling experience. But as you guys know, I don't take sides. I'm not a tribalist. I am only concerned about what the truth is. I am only concerned in bringing you what the truth is, always with receipts to back it up. Sorry about that. It's a little funny because when I was listening to the intro of the show today, in the intro to the show, I say that I discovered in 2020, when I was like running all over the place and was on all these shows and stuff like that, I discovered that conservatives are no better than Democrats. You know, a lot of people doubted my story when I woke up and left the left. They thought that I was just shilling and grifting and lying and all those stuff. And I didn't understand why at the time. I understand why now. But my story was real. And I didn't understand at the time just how many people did lie about their political evolutions and their political journeys. Now we're seeing in the past couple weeks, conservatives just like showing their true colors, man. And part of me is left sitting here going, why? Why? Why did I do any of this? Why did I put myself out there as a public person on the internet? Why? Well, the why at the time was I really thought I was doing the right thing. I really did. because how it was presented to me at the time was like, we need to speak up, we need to fight back, and if you speak up, we're going to protect you. If you speak up, we'll have your back. And I believed them. I believed them. That turned out not to be the case at all. And in fact, more and more and more, I'm just becoming convinced that everything that's going on the political right now is just designed to make money. It's just designed to make money. And that makes me sad because the left is an actual problem. The political left is an actual problem. And we're going to talk about that today. That's where we're going to spend most of our time today. What we're going to be doing on the show today is we are going to be picking up where we left off yesterday with our new friend, Henry. It's always nice to make new friends. It's always nice to discover new people. And by pure happenstance, yesterday, I discovered Henry. Now, Henry is an interesting character, and it's actually like people don't believe me when I say that I don't listen to James Lindsay. But I really don't. And the reason I don't listen to James Lindsay is not that I don't love and adore James Lindsay, because I think that James Lindsay and I have our disagreements. Don't get it twisted. We don't agree on everything, but I love and adore him because of how hard he worked, how far out ahead of out of all of this he was ahead of all of us. I love and adore that he just goes for it like guns blazing, doesn't give an F. And I think that the overall quality of his work in exposing where all these ideas have come from has just been exceptional. He has been a groundbreaker in this whole thing. He has been at the tip of the spear for a really, really, really long time. Now, I do fundamentally different things than James Lindsay. I focus on their training, the real world application of their ideas, whereas he focuses on the philosophy behind their ideas. Both are valuable in different ways, and both are necessary, right? The reason I bring James Lindsay up is I had no idea until yesterday that James Lindsay talks about our new friend Henry like all the time, apparently. Like complains about him all the time. I truly had no idea. And and that's because I don't listen to him, because I don't want to be influenced by what James Lindsay is doing. I truly want to be able to just watch the training, watch how it shows up in the world, watch the practical application of their ideas. I don't want James Lindsay in my head pulling me in one direction when the evidence might take me in another direction. That is the only reason I don't listen to him, okay? But the reason I bring him up is James Lindsay, my friend Woke Insurgency over on Twitter, showed me this today. James Lindsay trolled our new friend Henry epically with his book, The Marxification of Education, because Henry is a prolific author around critical pedagogy of the oppressed. Basically, Henry brought Paulo Freire's ideas to the United States, and Henry is one of the reasons that the schools in the United States, as James Lindsay said in his book, The Marxification of Education, are Paulo Freire schools. Now, Henry's written a lot of books. He's written this book here on critical pedagogy. He's written this book here, Pedagogy of Resistance. He's written this book here, Race, Politics, and Pandemic Pedagogy. He's written this book here, Insurrections. And fucking James Lindsay, the epic troll that he is, copied Henry's cover art and cover style in his book, The Marxification of Education. I mean, come on, man. You got to give Lindsay credit. That's hilarious. He is the king. He is the master. Like, I bow down land at the feet of James Lindsay because that is amazing. Anyway, we're going to continue with our newfound friend Henry today. We didn't quite get through this episode yesterday, and so I want to make sure we watch the rest of it because Henry said so many golden nuggets in this episode. And if you want to hear the golden nuggets that we took away, I actually have them up on my Substack, which is Carlin, Karlyn .substack.com. You can see kind of like the highlight reel of the crazy things that Henry said yesterday. Henry was talking about how they need to use education from an anti-capitalist angle to overcome like the fascist world, and fascism is defined as capitalism according to Henry. Henry told us that colonization also means capitalism. Henry was talking about how socialist the democratic socialists are the natural answer for everything that's wrong in the world. Henry gave us so much. It was amazing. And so you can find the highlight reel there. But we didn't quite even get all the way through the presentation. We still have about 20 minutes left of this one. And so I thought that we could just finish this presentation up just to make sure, because Henry was kind of on a roll in this presentation. And I want to make sure we don't miss any of the good stuff. And then after that, I have this talk also with Henry. And this is called Paulo Freire and the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Now, this is only a half hour long. And Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I'm really trying to avoid reading it. Can I be honest for a second? I'm really, 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 really trying to avoid reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I don't want to read it. And if I can listen to someone else talking about it and get the basic mise en scène of what is in that book, then I will do that instead. So we're going to attempt to do that in the second thing we're going to watch from our friend Henry today. And that's what we're going to spend most of our time doing. But before we get into that, I want to do an update from last week. You know, I said at the beginning that when I spent all of 2020 running around the conservative media circuit, being used, and I really do mean this, I was used by so many people on the conservative right as a symbol of a Democrat leaving the left and joining them, even though I was never a conservative. I literally never became a conservative. I never said I was a conservative or any of those things. I didn't realize at that time what the reason that I did the conservative media tour in 2020 is I really thought I was doing the right thing. I really, really did. I really thought I was, because after my Trump rally article went viral, I cannot tell you guys how many messages I got from people saying, thank you for your story. You've given me hope. Thank you for your story. I now have hope that I can mend fences with my family. Like I heard from so many people who found hope in my story about like waking up and leaving the left. And they were like, if she can do it, then maybe I can mend fences with my family. Maybe we can stop being at each other's throats, etc., etc., etc. Like, and so the reason I kept going was because, well, I was really pissed off at the left for lying to me my entire life, and I wanted other people to see. But B, I really thought, I knew my story inspired people, and I thought that if I could inspire people, that would be a good thing. Now, I was trying to do the right thing, and in the midst of doing that, I didn't realize that I was being used by the conservative fucking media establishment. I didn't realize that until much, much, much later. And I regret so much of what I did now. I regret doing a PragerU video. And I made videos about this before. This is not a new, this is not just because of the Israel thing that's happening now. I have made videos for probably about a year and a half now, if not almost 2 years, about how much I regretted doing the PragerU video. I just, like, on 19 different levels, like, I felt completely used. I would never make the same decision today, but then it was a different time. I didn't know. There's so much I didn't know. You can be very smart in some areas and very stupid in others. And I'm very smart. At that time, I was very smart in some areas, and I was very, very, very stupid in others. Maybe not stupid, maybe naive. So I've been screaming about how much I hate the conservative right for like a really long time, right? And I've been screaming basically since the beginning of 2021 that I think that most of the people on the conservative right are like shills. I ended up, for those who don't know, just like a brief backstory. So I ended up leaving the like kind of like distancing myself from conservatives and Republicans at around April or May of 2021. Now, what conservatives say is they say they kicked me out of the right, but that actually never happened. Like I left and then and then they put me through like several different rounds of like cancel campaigns, really culminating at the end of 2021, and like it was one of those situations where I was like, "Okay, I'm done. I quit." And conservatives were like, "You can't quit. You're fired." And I was like, "Um all right, well, I already quit, so bye." Like, and there were like rounds and rounds and rounds where I had to like break up with conservatives on like multiple occasions. There's actually a video of me at Pork Fest in 2022, like not even this year, last year, where I called it like, "Conservatives, can we please break up now?" Because Matt Walsh had just put me through another round of cancel bullshit. And I was literally just blocking conservatives on Twitter. I blocked like probably a couple thousand conservatives that night on Twitter because of like all like the ridiculous nonsense. And I did this whole stream while I was just blocking conservatives on Twitter from Porkfest saying, "Can we please break up now? Like, I tried to break up with you at the beginning of 2021. You just keep hanging around. I feel like I've tried to be nice. Can we just fucking break up now? Because, like, I'm over it. No, really, I'm over it." This just went on and on and on for like 2 years. It was bad. And in that time, I had some sense that something was wrong on the right. I had a sense that something was wrong. But I got to tell you, in the past couple of weeks, I have felt vindicated like I have never felt vindicated before in my life. And I'm actually really sad about that because there were people on the right that I wanted to believe in. There were people on the right that I really, 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 really wanted to believe that they cared about this stuff. I really did. And now we know for sure, or at least I know for sure, that they never did. So what does Nick Fuentes have to do with this? Let me take you on a journey back to last week. Let me take you back to last week. Just in case you missed the episode where I talked about this, because I have an update on this situation. It actually updated last week. I just didn't get around to talking about it until today. I have an update on this situation that I want to make sure people are aware of. But first, just to bring people up to speed, let me just play this clip from our young, precocious friend. And let's see what Nick Fuentes had to say on his show last week.
A tip earlier from somebody, and I got a tip earlier from somebody today. I'm not going to say who, but I got a tip that Dave Rubin, who you may know, Rubin Report, he's with DeSantis, who's a gay Jew. Dave Rubin is going around and calling people and trying to get certain conservatives fired from their job because they took the wrong position on Israel. This is a guy who, for years, his whole position was, I may be a liberal, but we ought to be able to have a conversation. This is just amazing. We get to have right and left people are having a conversation. Isn't this crazy? Don't burn this book. He says, don't burn this book. Let the right and the left talk. Now he's picking up the phone and saying, oy vey, shut it down. Get him fired from his job. He's an anti-Semite. He's anti-Semitic. Get him fired.
Now,
and I got a tip earlier.
Now, Nick Fuentes definitely, absolutely did not get that tip from me, because last week when I was just hanging around Twitter, I definitely didn't hear from, maybe a couple people that Dave Rubin was flying off the handle and calling people, demanding that people be fired because he didn't like their take on. I definitely didn't hear that from anyone. It didn't happen. I don't know where anyone would get that idea. And when I absolutely did not hear that from people, because I don't talk to anyone. As everyone know, everyone hates me. I'm just like the pariah of the internet. No one tells me anything. And when no one told me anything last week, I definitely didn't pass that information on to Nick Fuentes, hoping that he might be precocious enough to talk about it on his show. And then I may have been watching the show that night and took a clip of it and posted it on Twitter. And Dave wasn't too happy about this. He denied it. But I have to ask, do you usually block people over things that are provably false? Like, if it was so easy for Dave Rubin to just like, you know what, this is obviously a lie. Nick Fuentes is obviously precocious, obviously just a little troublemaker, a complete and obvious lie. Why would Dave Rubin have blocked me on Twitter over that? You know, Dave is supposed to be the free speech advocate of the internet. Dave is supposed to believe in productive and rational conversation. And if Dave Rubin absolutely did not in any way call for people to be fired over speech that he didn't like, even though Dave publicly called for protests to be outlawed, even though Dave publicly called for people to be deported, even though Dave Rubin has been bullying Kim Iverson for like weeks, calling her like AOC level stupid. I'm not sure Dave is one to talk there, but okay, we'll just put that aside for a second. Even though he did all those things, if it was so easy to say, you know what, I didn't call anyone. Listen, guys, I've been lied about on the internet. I've been lied about a lot on the internet. I've had horrible lies spread about me on the internet. I know they're not true. I know what happened. And so do I spend all my time like, you know, retaliating? Okay, sometimes I retaliate against some people because that's just good fun sometimes. But if it was so obviously false what Nick Fuentes was saying, then why would Dave Rubin block me on Twitter? I just want to take you guys back to when Dave Rubin and his husband, also named Dave or David, had kids. Now, I don't have any problem with Dave and David having kids. I have no issue with it at all. I know some people do. I'm not going to argue about that right now, but I've met David. He's a lovely person. I think that him and Dave make a great couple. I think that him and Dave are going to provide an extremely loving and caring environment for those kids. And I know David really wanted kids. And I'm sure they're going to have the best life and they're going to be loved. And that's really all that matters at the end of the day. And, you know, gay men should be able to have families too. I know people don't agree with me on this, on some things like the surrogacy thing. I get it. But if those kids are going to be provided with a loving family, then I don't have any issue with that. Okay. I just don't. But I remember, does anyone remember the backlash when Dave announced that they were having these kids via surrogacy? Because I remember it. I did a whole video about it, ranting at the time. I thought it was disgusting. I really did. I saw all of these conservatives who claimed to be friends with Dave just turning around and just shitting on him over and over and over and over and over again. And there was like no one defending them. And I thought it was gross and I thought it was sick And I thought it was ridiculous among people who claim to be pro-family. But you know what I thought was interesting is at the time, Dave said, well, they're all my friends and we're allowed to have differences of opinion. So back in the day, Dave Rubin still remained friends with people who were literally shitting on his family. On his family. That's pretty gross. But you disagree with Dave on Israel, and you disagree with Dave's actions of absolutely not calling people's bosses and demanding they be fired, and calling for the censorship of protests he doesn't like, and calling for people to be deported when he doesn't like what they're saying. You disagree with his actions around free speech when he's supposed to be the free speech advocate of the internet, and he's going to block you. So much for civil conversation. Now, I kind of thought this was going to happen, if I'm honest about it. Like, Dave is notorious for blocking people. I haven't actually spoken with Dave in like 2 years. Like, I wouldn't even say I don't even know if we were ever actually friends. I think Dave was probably using me for what he could have too. And it was what it was. And I accepted when I definitely didn't tell Nick Fuentes that Dave was doing that, hoping he would talk about it on his show. When I did that, I knew that this was probably going to happen, and I was like, you know what, whatever. I have barely interacted with Dave in like years. It's really not that big of a deal. He doesn't share my work. He doesn't support my work. He hasn't done anything to help me in a really long time. So why shouldn't I tell the truth? Why should I stifle myself and what the truth is in order to keep him happy on Twitter? Does that sound like something I would do? I don't think so. But I just couldn't help myself. I just couldn't help myself because you guys know I definitely don't have sock accounts where I can still see what people are saying. And it kind of seems to me that Dave has learned nothing from being called out by multiple people for his complete 180 on free speech. And I just want to read you something that Dave tweeted earlier today, because this was just, for me, this was just the cherry on top of my black pill with what's really going on with the conservative right. Dave tweeted, "The current thing brainwashing the masses has moved into a new phase. It's obvious if you're willing to see the truth. COVID, BLM, trans, Palestine." As though there hasn't always been a Palestine freedom movement. But that doesn't seem to matter to Dave. Anyway, there are 2 questions now. How do we make the latest mind virus less infectious? Will good people stand up and fight? You know, it was that last line. Will good people stand up and fight? It was that line that really got me. Because like I said, Dave hasn't supported my work in years. And I kind of feel like for the last 2 years, I'm pretty sure that I've been a good person that's been standing up and willing to fight. I'm pretty sure. Maybe people don't agree with me. I'm pretty sure that I wrote a whole book about how to fight back against the left. That book includes checklists. That book includes detailed breakdowns about what's going on so that average people can understand it. It includes tactics that anyone can do in their town to try to make a dent in what the left is doing. Dave knew about that book. Dave refused to talk about it, and when I asked him about it, because this is back when we were talking, he made some lame excuse that I knew was a lie and just refused to even look at it. But when will good people stand up and fight back? I literally wrote a book about fighting back, providing people with the tools to fight back, and Dave refused to talk about it. Well, I mean, I'm sure he had his reasons for that. Um, Maybe Dave just doesn't think my work is very good. You'll have to judge for yourself on that. But then I kept going after the book. I kept breaking all these news stories that Dave very rarely shared about what was going on in the schools. I, started working with volunteers on that were organized on his platform of locals. Now we've moved into other places, but when it first started, it was all organized on locals. You might think that might be something Dave would want to talk about, right? That he had organized communities on his platform that were specifically like volunteering to like fight back and infiltrate conferences and show people what's going on and do research that no one else is willing to do, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Dave never wanted to talk about it. Dave claims he unfollowed me on Twitter a couple weeks ago. Well, do you know what I was doing a couple weeks ago on Twitter? I was posting information from the socialism conference, the 3-day event that I went undercover at with like 400 Antifa. Dave wonders when good people are going to fight back. I wonder. I just have to wonder. What does he mean when he says fight back? What does he mean exactly? Did he mean like when I got the president of the ALA, the American Library Association, recorded saying that she wants to make libraries the site of Marxist organizing? Is that what Dave meant by fighting back? Because I was the only one that did that. So what is going to be good enough? What is going to be good enough for these people? The answer is nothing's going to be good enough for these people, because these people never cared in the first place. And this is what I'm getting smacked in the face with today. These people never cared in the first place because Dave Rubin never cared and never supported any of the work I did fighting back against the left, teaching people how to fight back against the left, showing what the left was doing constant deep dives about what the left was doing, posting constant clips on Twitter about what the left is doing. Dave was following me all the time up until he unfollowed me. Well, he says when I was posting information about the socialism conference, I say that he unfollowed me when I called out his ass on free speech. But when are good people going to stand up and do something, huh, Dave? It seems that Dave only wants people to stand up and do something when it comes to standing up for Israel. That's what it seems like to me. It seems like the only good work that Dave appreciates is when people stand up for a country that's not America. There were all these big time Jewish Wall Street guys last week that basically started threatening Ivy League universities, saying, we're going to close our checkbook unless you get your people under control, because obviously these Ivy League universities have been having pro-Hamas protests. Now, I don't support pro-Hamas protests. I wouldn't go to a pro-Hamas protest. I'm not pro-Israel. I'm not pro-Palestine. I'm not pro-Hamas. I'm anti-war and anti-genocide, and that's about as far as I go. But I found it funny that these big-time Jewish donors were very willing to close their checkbooks and like fund millions of dollars worth of repercussions for college students saying things they don't like, because some of us are old enough and involved enough to know that the woke ideology has been literally pushed down from Ivy League universities to all of us for decades. For decades. This isn't new. We've known about it for a long time. Every crazy thing that you see in the public schools today started in the Ivy League universities. And it trickled down from there. And people like me, and I suppose we could say people like Dave as well, because he was the free speech advocate leader of the intellectual dark web, have been screaming for years about this. We've been screaming for years about where the problem is coming from. We've been screaming for years demanding it be defunded, and no one cared. No one cared. No one did anything. The people who were cutting the big checks to the Ivy League universities that were funding this garbage in the first place still continued to cut those big checks up until Israel happened. And then, all of a sudden, they cared enough to close the bank account. How much garbage could have been stopped if they had maybe closed the piggy bank a little sooner? If maybe they had taken an interest in what was happening a little bit sooner? But they didn't, because they don't care. Dave Rubin doesn't care about free speech. Dave Rubin only cares about Israel. Ben Shapiro doesn't care about free speech. Ben Shapiro only cares about Israel. None of these people on the conservative right, that I'm going to say it, is completely fucking captured by Jewish fucking influencers who all of a sudden they've been claiming to care about this stuff for years, using people like me as symbols that they could hold up and say, see, we really do care. We really do care. We're the good side. We're the right side. We're doing all the right things. Come join us. Look, we have this person who left the left and left the Democrats because she saw. Why don't you come and join us as well, PragerU? None of them actually cared about any of it. None of them. All they ever cared about was Israel. OG Nick, thank you for the super chat. You are the most consistent person, the gold standard. I really thought that mattered at one point. I really did. Why do they care so much about Israel? That's a good question, Kansas Mama. Why do they care more about Israel than they do about the United States? That's a better question. Why does Dave Rubin continue to lie to people saying, when will the good people stand up and fight? It's just the only people that Dave Rubin considers to be good right now are Jewish people who are speaking out in favor of Israel. When will everyone else join them? We have to deprogram the latest mind virus that has caused people to question the veracity and the supremacy of fucking Israel. I never cared if people were Jewish 2 weeks ago. Didn't care. Didn't care at all. Thought all of the things that people like Nick Fuentes said about all of this was crazy talk. Really, really did. But it's kind of like waking up and seeing what the left was doing with social justice and woke indoctrination. It's kind of like that. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I'm pretty sure I've been one of the good people. I'm pretty sure that I've done more to fight back against the left and inspired more people to do more to fight back against the left than almost any person in the country. And I don't say that to pat myself on the back. I say it because it's the truth. I've inspired millions of people. And I know that. Sadly, that doesn't mean I necessarily have the platform that Dave does, because Dave has connections I don't have. Sadly, that doesn't necessarily mean I have the numbers that he does, because a lot of people just want to be lied to. And a lot of people just want to hear their talking points. But you'll have to pardon me for being, well, a little confused at why Dave Rubin has such a hard time finding the good people when it was literally in his Twitter feed for years and he ignored it. And you'll have to excuse my skepticism when I say, how did you not see? If this was something you actually cared about, how did you not see? And you'll have to excuse my ambivalence over the fact that Dave is more passionate about what's going on in Israel than he has been about anything else that he's talked about in the entire time that I knew who Dave Rubin was. But you all can form your own conclusions about what that means about him and what he's contributing and what he cares about and what he doesn't care about. Remember, guys, don't listen to people's words. Look at their actions. Look at where they're putting their energy. Look at where they're putting their attention. Now, for those of you who are serious about fighting back against the woke left, you can find a ton of resources over on my Substack. You can buy my book that Dave Rubin refused to even look at, which is Actively Unwoke, the ultimate guide for fighting back against the woke insanity in your life. You can find a link in the description below. You can also check out my Substack for resources. I've got a ton of stuff on there. I've got the Woke 101 series. I've got the Woke Mind series. I've got the video vault that's getting built out with clips from all the different trainings we watched of thousands of hours of woke trainings that we've been watching over the past 3 years. We've graduated from like standard entry-level woke trainings now to full-form socialism and like the farthest of the far left. I'm going to have all sorts of levels on the Substack. And guys, listen, we're coming up to the end of the year. I can't believe it's almost November. I cannot believe this. I am not quite where I would like to be in terms of total members on my Substack. And I have a little ground that I would like to make up between now and the end of the year, because you guys know that my work fighting back, even though it will never be acknowledged by people like Dave Rubin, even though it will never be acknowledged by people like Ben Shapiro, even though it will never be acknowledged pretty much by the conservative establishment, I do know that it is acknowledged by people like you, by average people, boots on the ground people who don't care to play in any of these political games, who just want to show up in your life and get things done. And if you want to support the work I'm doing, I will provide you with tools. I will provide you with resources. I will provide you with as much stuff as I possibly can. All that I ask is that you fund it in return for $8 a month or $80 a year. You can sign up on my Substack, Carlyn, KARLYN.substack.com. You get access to member-only perks like Zoom calls with me, like the supporter Discord, other stuff too, supporter-exclusive spy streams, stuff like that. If you do want to, I literally can't do this without you guys. All this time that we spend watching these trainings and I spend making clips and then breaking it down and putting it on the Substack and building courses around and building webinars around and all that stuff, I only have that time because you fund my work. So if you've been waiting to sign up for the Substack, now is going to be a great time, because not only will you fund the work I'm doing, but I will also send you a 10% off discount code that you can use in the Unwoke Art merchandise store just as a little extra thank you. You know, I'm going to be turning over the merchandise line in my Unwoke Art store. I'm going to be taking some items out. I'm going to be adding some new stuff. I'm going to be switching some stuff over. We're going to do a whole holiday line. It's going to be great. So if you want to support the work I'm doing and get some cool merch and gifts for the holidays, which is going to be the best, you can get a 10% off code when you sign up for my Substack as a paying supporter. It'll come right in your welcome email, and then you can go and get some goodies for your friends, families, or even for yourself, stuff like that. My merch is some of the coolest merch on the internet. I'm really excited about it. I've got some cool stuff coming up in the store pretty soon. I think you guys are going to like it, and all of this does go to fund the work I'm doing, and I really, really, really appreciate it. Couple more programming notes before we dig into our video for today. Of course, this is Tuesday, and that means this is not my last stream of the day. It is but my first stream of the day, and I will be going live with Joshua at 9:30 tonight for Nothing Remotely Controversial. This is psychic fun time, okay? If you don't like psychics, if you don't like tarot cards, don't come. But we are going to be doing the show tonight where we will talk about the news and whatever's going on in the world, and Joshua will use his psychic powers to help us try to predict what's going to happen next. It's always a fun, lighthearted show. I hope I will see you at 9:30 tonight. And tomorrow is a big day. Big day. Now, I have to apologize to my supporters. I was really hoping that this was going to be later on in the day, but I am canceling tomorrow's supporter Zoom call. I'm sorry, but the reason I'm canceling it is Nick Fuentes is going to be debating Alex Jones live about Gaza and Israel and all that sort of stuff. And I want to do a watch party for it because I want to watch this. I really want to watch this. I think it's going to be a great debate and I want to watch it live. And just I know that I'm sorry. I know you guys are going to, I will make it up to you, but we're going to have such a good time at the watch party tomorrow. I am starting it. It starts at 1 p.m. Eastern time, I think. So I'm going to be starting it about 15 minutes before that. And sadly, that's just when we have our supporter Zoom call. So we're just going to cancel it for this week. I very rarely cancel a supporter Zoom call. If I'm doing it, it's for good reason. And I promise I'll make it up to you, but it's going to be so good. And so I hope you will join me for that. And, I mean, it is what it is, I guess, right? Milk tea graper, it is what it is. But we're going to have a lot of fun with that tomorrow. And I hope you guys will join me for that. All right. With that said, please mount the like button for me. Mounting the like button allows people to know to come and join us on this here stream. We are going to be picking up where we left off yesterday with our new friend, Henry. And we are going to continue watching the rest of this presentation, and then we're going to watch one more presentation from Henry, and we're going to see if he says any more of the quiet part out loud. If you missed yesterday's presentation, don't worry about it. We're just listening for Henry to say the quiet part out loud. But I will continue to try to break down what he's saying. If you guys have questions about what Henry is saying, please put them in the chat. We will try to answer them. If you feel like you don't understand what he's saying, please tell us because we can try to help you. Remember, socialists speak a different language than us. They don't speak English. They speak a coded language that I call socialist. It's very academic. It's flowery. It can sometimes be a little confusing. They use they use the same words, the same vocabulary as us, but they have a completely different dictionary. Okay, so same words, different definition. If you guys have questions, put them in the chat. We will try our very best to answer them. And let's keep going with where we left off yesterday. Critical pedagogy is the antidote to neoliberal fascism.
I'm sorry. I mean, that's an educational act. What are you combining here? You're combining theory and practice. You're combining consciousness with the...
All right, guys, just like yesterday, Henry's a little bit quiet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn down my microphone. And I need everyone to turn up the volume on their individual computers. And that's how we're going to level this out. I appreciate it.
Will to both understand the problem and to act on it. In the deepest sense, that's an educational issue.
Yes, but was it taught in schools? Was it taught in Iranian schools?
I think there are two elements of Iranian schooling. And one could argue this for almost all countries. There's always a hidden curriculum. Part of that hidden curriculum can be very repressive. Things that are done to students that are not talked about, but basically a part of the curriculum, right? Racism.
Well, that was the ironclad law of woke projection in action. There's always a hidden curriculum that things can be done to students that are very repressive. Oh, really, Henry? Really? Tell us more.
We don't talk about racism, but yet there's massive segregation in schools. Then there are students who basically, as Paul Willis once argued in Learning to Labor, who in those institutions create their own forms of education, talk to each other. They understand that teachers are full of bullshit at times. They understand that schooling has nothing to do with their lives. They understand that they have to read in alternative study groups. I mean, when I went to school, I didn't learn anything. I learned how to type. Everything I learned in school was how to type, right? But in the study groups, after school, in the study groups with people who are on the left, I learned a lot. I mean, I remember coming across the Mass Psychology of Fascism by Wilhelm Reich, or a whole range of theorists, and all of a sudden driving 2 hours to Boston to get a book so we could sit down on a Friday night and talk about this stuff. So it was always in those informal educational groups that are marked by a crisis in established education that I think students begin to put things together that ordinarily they wouldn't have access to.
Yeah, you told me that amongst in the working class we were reading Gramsci back in the days.
Gramsci.
But go back to Chile. Go back to Chile under Allende, And look at the film, that famous film on Chile, where people would assume that workers are stupid, right?
Mhm.
They had study groups reading Marx, reading Marx. People talking about Marx. Think about the socialist schools in the United States in the 1920s and 30s. There were, my friend late Stanley Aronowitz would talk about all these parallel institutions that existed, where people learned outside of the normal institutions that they serve as repressive. And even think about the various.
Bro, it sometimes is a little bit hard to find people who want to sit down and listen to hardcore socialism, but perhaps you could do something productive and ask good questions about what's going on, or maybe go invite some people and say, hey, do you really want to know what the far left is doing? Because we're watching it right now, right in front of us. Are you smart enough to do that, or do you just want to shit post in my chat? The choice is really up to you. The reality is that they're like about half of the population isn't even smart enough to understand this stuff. So, am I offended that I've got 83 hardcore people and a whole bunch of people on Rumble too watching this right now? Nah. The right people are watching, and that's really all that matters.
Jewish schools that were very left wing in the 19s and 30s, right, talking about social problems and so forth and so on. And I also think that when you think about the possibility of education existing critically in particular institutions, I think one of the things we see on the right, which we're talking about, is a recognition that if established education can be defined as a democratic public sphere, what it does is so dangerous it can spread, right? It can become part of other social spheres. It can infect the social media. You have alternative schools that might develop. The thing that I find striking is in the United States, you talked about Betsy DeVos. Betsy DeVos is about privatizing public education. She hates public school teachers. She hates the notion of the public.
I hate public school teachers too.
She's an educational war criminal. And I think in many ways, what they have done is they have fashioned on to a notion of the private, in which choice is always about self-interest, which is the central ideology of neoliberalism, right?
Yes.
Self-interest, and now they want to fashion institutions around that.
Yes.
So that they connect people completely off from any notion of a larger public consciousness, or what I call the public imagination. What's the relationship between?
What he's talking about is the collective versus the individual. See, we're individualists on this channel. We believe in individual liberty and meritocracy, and we love capitalism so much, because capitalism is held up by individualism and meritocracy. Henry doesn't like capitalism very much. In fact, if you missed yesterday's show, we have a lot of clips of Henry shitting on capitalism and talking about how he doesn't like capitalism and we need to use education to get rid of capitalism and stuff like that, because Henry is not an individualist. Henry is a collectivist. Henry wants everything to be part of the public sphere. That's why Henry hates the idea of private schools, because Henry doesn't have control over what private schools teach students, and Henry doesn't like that, because Henry wants to be able to control what's taught to students, because that's Henry's very definition of democracy. His definition of democracy is going to be controlling what ideas people are allowed to consider, because that's what happens when they form their little socialist utopia. You always got to be keeping an eye out for those things. Are they talking about individualism or collectivism? Individualism good, collectivism bad.
Between education and the public imagination. How do you think that out? What role does education play in a democracy, or should play? What role should intellectuals play, teachers, academics, in a time of rising fascism and tyranny? What
fascism means capitalism.
We have beyond sort of surviving, if I may put it this way, within these territorial disciplines where we only talk to 5 people, right? And have no sense of the connection between public schools and the larger public. Something has happened in countries like the United States where the public schools have become not only social sorting machines, but they've been linked to a notion of meritocracy. Feed your vita, make sure you go to law school, make sure you become a doctor, where whatever role they have as a public good now collapses into that neoliberal ideology of self-interest.
You just hear what he said? Schools feed the system of meritocracy. What does meritocracy mean? What does meritocracy mean? Pop quiz for the chat. What does meritocracy mean, and why does Henry think that meritocracy is bad? I'm going to give you a hint. In Oregon, they just made it possible for non-white students to graduate from high school without ever learning how to read. True story. They don't believe, in Oregon, they don't believe that black students should be forced to learn how to read in order to graduate from high school. What does that have to do with meritocracy? Meritocracy is, meritocracy does lead to inequity. Absolutely. Meritocracy supports capitalism. Absolutely. Meritocracy leads to inequity. Socialists hate nothing more than inequity. Meritocracy is individualism. It means that not everyone is going to end at the same place. It's about he who shows up and works hard. Meritocracy is about equality of opportunity. Everyone shows up, everyone gets a chance at the job, the best man wins. That's what meritocracy is. Henry doesn't like meritocracy. Henry thinks that meritocracy goes against the public good. Why would meritocracy go against the public good? Does anyone know? Let me know what you think in the chat. Why does meritocracy go against the public good? Thank you, Terry, for the super chat. I appreciate it. Millions of people in Britain and the US own their homes and businesses. How would the Marxist utopia be ushered in? I can't imagine all these people just willing to hand over their property. I don't know functionally how they would handle that, Terry, but I do know that at some point private property would absolutely be outlawed and it would be collectivized. I mean, listen, eminent domain is a thing. There was a big to-do over this bar in San Antonio, Texas last year, where libertarians were actually protesting it because this guy had run this bar right across the street from the Alamo for years and years and years, had put his money into it, had put his heart into it, his soul into it. This was his private business. The city of San Antonio claimed it via eminent domain and forced him out. So it's not as though the government hasn't done this before. The government has done this. The government has done this the entire time the U.S. has been alive, or existed rather. I shouldn't say alive. So can the state take private property away from citizens and push them out of it? Oh, you bet it can. Absolutely. Meritocracy encourages competition, which brings out our egos, which makes human bad. Well, it's not necessarily that so much as socialists and far leftists do not believe that competition should exist. They don't believe that people should compete with each other because, again, competition is about individualism. Collectivism is about everyone assimilating to the Borg. All right? And so collectivist societies are not big on competition. They look for ways to bring about like cooperation, everyone belongs to everyone else sort of thing. And so they don't like meritocracy because meritocracy leads to competition. You also can't have equity when you have meritocracy. Competition leads to inequity because someone's going to win and someone's going to lose. So they're always looking for ways for everyone to end in the same place. Does that make sense?
Excuse me, and that is enormously destructive, to say the least.
Back in the 60s and 70s, you read Gramsci, Howard Zinn, Aronowitz, Chomsky. Those are towering intellectuals who don't really have their equal today. So who inspires us today? You know, voices like Howard Zinn and Chomsky. Do we have younger intellectuals that have the same influence today?
I think it's a very interesting question, and it's a very complex.
You know, I hear about this numbers thing like all the time. Like, the internet is like, who has the biggest numbers, bro? Who has the most followers, bro? Who has the most views, bro? I've never actually really like bought into the numbers thing. I come from an industry where it really is all about like quality. It is not about quantity. And if you have the right quality, then you can thrive on very small numbers. So that was never a thing to me. But like, I want people to just think about this. Like, do you know how these people influenced? Do you know how these people gained so much power? They became professors in universities. Sometimes professors have classes of hundreds of people. Sometimes professors have classes of 30 people. But professors at universities, on a good day, don't usually speak to as many people as I speak to on an average day. And yet people like rag on my numbers like all the time. Well, fine, like I'm cool with it, but like I just find I think it's I just think it's like funny to think about this, because you have these people that got these professorships in these big time universities, and they're speaking usually to less people in a day than I speak to in a day, and they were able to influence the direction of the entire country because there were so many of them across so many universities teaching so many people. You know, in some ways I'm absolutely an individualist in that I absolutely do believe in like individualism and capitalism and stuff like that. But in other respects, I'm like, I really wish there were a lot more people talking about this, and I really wish there were a lot more people doing what I'm doing, because I'm not the best teacher for everyone. I'm just not. We can all acknowledge that. Like, you either love me or you hate me, and I'm cool with that. But for all the people who hate me or all the people who would never hear of me, like, I really wish they had other people to watch, because if there were more people doing this, then more people would wake up quicker, and it would be much easier to get enough people to actually fight back against it. But dare to dream, I suppose. But just keep that in mind. Like, these people didn't influence culture with thousands of people watching them every day. These people influence culture with small classes over the course of years and years and years and years. That's how you get things done. It's not always about the biggest boom. It's about the most consistently showing up every single day.
Next question. I think that it would be unfair to claim.
Hang on. Terry, displacing millions of people would be unimaginable. What do you think is happening in Gaza right now? There are literally right now in Gaza 1 million people displaced because Israel wants that property. What do you think's happening right now? This literally is not in the United States, but it's happening in Gaza as we speak.
This generation, your generation, and younger generations can't produce their own intellectuals. They will produce intellectuals in a different social context, dealing with different technologies and dealing with different issues. And some of them will be brilliant, and some of them will get the publicity that they need to be able to, I believe, talk to other people. But I think you have to remember that the Zins, Chomskys, the Stanley Aronowitzes grew up at a time when the culture supported their work. There was a possibility to be heard. You had the 60s. I think that what I've been grappling with that we don't want to forget is they grew up at a time when the forces of democratization were on the move. There was the war against Vietnam.
Justin wants to know, why did the social liberals allow leftists to take over the universities? It's not like leftists will tolerate social liberals once they have enough power. What's the alternative, Justin? What's the alternative? There is no alternative for social liberals. That's the answer. There is no alternative for social liberals. And that's because of the conservative right. Conservatives could be the alternative if they actually cared about individual liberty. Conservatives could be the alternative if they actually cared about the things that they claim to care about, but they don't. And social liberals are know enough to know that. And so it comes down to a choice. It's like, which devil do you dance with? I'm going to be honest, where I'm at right now, I think that the right now is far more dangerous than the left. In terms of the things that I personally care about, maybe not in terms of like the big picture, but I'm looking at the devils on the right now, and by that I might mean Zionists. I'm looking at that, and I'm looking at the left, and I'm like, I hate the left. I hate everything the left stands for. But, and this is just for me personally, everyone has to make their own choices. I don't have a choice with the right. Like that's not a tenable option for me. You know what I'm saying? So, what option do they have? That tells you where they go.
Globally, as you know, right? There was an attempt in some way to deal with there's the civil rights movement. There was the anti-racist movements. There was the gay rights movements. The question of resistance, power, and intelligence were in the air. They were in the air.
Yeah, yeah.
And we moved with Reagan and Thatcher into a period of darkness, anti-intellectual darkness. The unions were broken, whether it was the miners in England or it was the flight attendants and the flight crews in the United States. And then the attack took place in the schools. The Powell memo in the United States said democracy's in excess. We have to stop this. We have to create our own intellectuals. I call them anti-public intellectuals. That's what they are. And they're everywhere. They're in the universities. They're massively funded, and they just spread garbage like the Heritage Foundation. They spread ideological garbage everywhere.
Wow.
And so it seems to me the environment is not as conducive. The second thing is we're caught in a period.
I just want to know
with.
when Henry says anti-intellectual, what does he mean? What does he mean? What do you guys think? Pop quiz for the chat. When Henry says anti-intellectual, what does he mean? I know I want him to say Chris Rufo so badly too. Anti-intellectual means not socialist. Exactly. Anti-Marxist, 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 anti-Marxist. Anti-intellectual means anti-Marxist.
Intellectually. And that is, I'm older. I'm older. I think in terms of the totality. I come out of a generation, we think in terms of comprehensive politics. We brought things together. We don't believe that these differences should be dealt with in isolated fashion. They overlap. They have to be related because they point to a larger structure that's really the root cause, as Marx would say, of the problem. I think this emphasis on isolated issues, it's cut off from other issues, has so hurt the left globally. Now, at one level, you have to recognize it's expanded the range of oppressions and made them visible, and that's fabulous. But when it becomes sclerotic.
Hang on, I got a super chat from Nathaniel. Thank you, Nathaniel. Just wanted to chat in as I'm a bit behind, and I'll be hopping into chat to learn more. But for your encouragement, thanks to your work on this, you've gotten me to run for my local county's board. Congratulations, Nathaniel. Everyone wish Nathaniel luck in running for his local county's board. That's going to be great. Guys, I really recommend if you're going to get involved in politics, get involved locally, hyper locally, if you can help it. The more local you can get involved, the more influence you're actually able to have. Like even in a lot of places, like a place in New Hampshire, you can get involved on state level stuff and that's going to be okay. But if you go to states that are like much bigger than New Hampshire, you're probably not going to be able to make that much of a difference, to be honest. And just forget about national politics. National politics is absolute bullshit. It is a complete waste of your time. It is the uniparty. The Republicans are useless. They're goddamn useless. And so if you're going to do something, do exactly what Nathaniel's doing and get involved at the local level if you can.
When they become ossified and when biology starts to define politics, I mean, you listen to Angela Davis, one of the great voices of the 21st century,
Communist.
who says, no, I'm not simply a Black intellectual, I'm a revolutionary. Meaning
Oh,
that her interest goes far beyond matters of race without denigrating race. And I think this generation has to somehow come to grips with that lack. They have to go back to what it means in some fundamental way to study groups, to working together, to building larger models, intellectual models. And they have to fight the anti-intellectualism of the
anti-Marxism.
culture. Remember, who are the heroes for young kids? Kim Kardashian?
Yeah,
I mean, Instagram?
yeah.
I mean, think of where the spaces are that generate, as you would suggest, and I'm talking about narratives of agency. They are really powerful. I mean, my generation didn't have to. I didn't have the internet. I had books, right? I mean, we read differently. Our literacy was more pronounced. Literacy now is fragmented and fractured, and it demands a broader notion of literacy. You have to read the media critically. You have to read. You have to understand how to be a cultural producer. This is an enormous burden on young people.
Yeah.
The next thing is that, look, you don't want to underestimate the pain that young people are experiencing globally, as you know. I mean, high debt in education, few jobs. They're constantly talked about as being selfish and stupid,
He does,
endlessly
doesn't he,
denigrated.
Tayton?
The problem with young
Thank
people is
you.
they're a long-term investment. Neoliberalism doesn't believe in long-term investments, it believes in short-term investments, quick profits.
Neoliberalism means capitalism. Just for those who missed yesterday, every single time he says neoliberalism, he means capitalism. That's why he just said neoliberalism believes in short-term investment, quick profits. Quick profits equal capitalism. He's using those two terms interchangeably.
That means you have to invest in them. They don't want to do that. So they're dangerous. And so the war against youth now is global in ways like we've never seen before. When you have politicians in the United States saying that a 10-year-old, if she's raped by her father, cannot have an abortion by virtue of the fact that that somehow constitutes a sin against white Christian fundamentalism, you're in trouble. When all of a sudden food stamp programs are being taken away, when Social Security is collapsing, this is not just a war on adults, it's a war on young people. It's a war on a generation. It's going to take a generation to dig itself out of this. They've been eliminated. They've been written out of the script of democracy, and they've been written out of the script for the future.
I think it depends on what country you're from.
I agree.
Iran is a different story from America. It's a different story from the Netherlands. Abortion is not as big as an issue as it is.
Guys, I'm going to say that literacy does not mean just knowing how to read. And I know I acknowledge that the right often makes this mistake. And, why wouldn't they? Because that's actually the definition. But like when they say literacy, I agree with John. This is more about literacy in critical consciousness. In looking at the world, like cultural literacy rather than like, do they know how to read? The left doesn't care if kids know how to read. Schools aren't teaching kids how to read. Like 1/3 of students of public high school students in America graduate knowing how to read. They don't care about kids knowing how to read books. They do care about kids being well versed in critical consciousness, viewing everything through the lens of oppression. I think that's right, John. I do.
This in America, here in the Netherlands, we have possibilities without being prosecuted. When I have a lunch break and I walk through the canteen, all my students, they don't talk anymore. The only thing they do is watching their phones. They are laughing, but they're laughing alone. They're sitting in a group of 10 students. They're laughing, but they're not talking. They're watching some kind of meme. And as long as they are fed their daily amount of dopamine, they're fine. They don't care about democracy. As long as they have Snapchat, Instagram, they're fine. That's what they tell me.
I'll tell you something. You've hit on something enormously important that I wish I had raised earlier. And that is endemic to this neoliberal capitalism is an unbelievable degree of loneliness and anxiety and isolation. Social atomization is the
Holy shit. Holy shit. Do you know what Henry just did? So this guy, okay, what have I told you guys? The 4 goals of the woke left are always and forever the same. Hang on, let me just finish this part of my knitting so I have a good place to leave off, because not screwing up my knitting is important. The 4 goals of the woke left are always and forever the same. Gain as much power as possible, destabilize the system, attack capitalism, usher in their Marxist utopia. All right? So when I've explained these, I've explained that the woke left get themselves into positions of power where they can make decisions. They then use that decision-making capability to cause problems that cause normal people pain. That's what destabilizing the system means. And then when normal people start to feel pain, the left comes and says, you know whose fault that is? It's capitalism. Capitalism is the culprit. Capitalism is the thing that has caused all your problems. The reason you're experiencing all this pain right now is not because of my decisions. It's because of capitalism, the oppressive force of capitalism. So maybe we want to try Marxism. Maybe we want to try that instead. Do you want to try Marxism? Because we don't like capitalism. Capitalism's causing problems. Do you want to try Marxism? What did Henry just say? Remember, the teachers' unions are what kept the public schools shut down. The teachers' unions are what kept kids wearing masks over their faces for years. And there were those of us screaming from the very beginning of the pandemic. You can go back and look at videos on my channel. From the very beginning, I said, this masking thing is going to cause problems. This masking thing is going to F these kids up. This masking thing is going to get in the way of them developing social relationships and social function. And what happened? What happened when the schools finally reopened and kids were going back to school and going to lunch? There was reports that when kids were going back to school, when they were sitting in the cafeteria, they wouldn't talk to each other because they had learned not to talk to each other because they were wearing masks all the time. So they learned not to talk to each other. They learned not to communicate with other people. They were only communicating through their phone. Now let's go back to what Henry just said. They're talking about there's so much loneliness in these kids. These kids are so lonely. And they're going to lunch and they're not talking to each other at lunch. They're just looking at their phone at lunch. And who does Henry blame for that? Capitalism. Henry literally just said, you know what? You know why all these kids are so lonely? Capitalism. Capitalism is your problem. We're going to go back and listen again. But this is how this shows up, guys. And I really want you to see this. These people put themselves in a position of power. These people use that position of power to destabilize the system. And then when that destabilization started causing noticeable problems in the population, the critical pedagogy expert in the United States himself said, do you know what's what's the reason behind all these problems? Capitalism. Of course it was capitalism. It was capitalism all along. Hey, how about we try Marxism instead? He didn't say that last part, but that's what's coming after this. Let's watch.
In America, here in the Netherlands, we have possibilities without being prosecuted. You know, when I have a lunch break and I walk through the canteen, all my students, they don't talk anymore. The only thing they do is watching their phones. They are laughing, but they're laughing alone. They're sitting in a group of 10 students. They are laughing, but they're not talking. They're watching some kind of meme. And as long as they are fed their daily amount of dopamine, they're fine. They don't care about democracy. As long as they have Snapchat, Instagram, they're fine. That's what they tell me.
I'll tell you something. You've hit on something enormously important that I wish I had raised earlier. And that is endemic to this neoliberal capitalism is an unbelievable degree of loneliness and anxiety and isolation. Social atomization is the poison of neoliberalism.
Yep.
It's one of the poisons. And you lose your sense of connection, you lose your sense of solidarity, you lose your sense of the social. Rania and I have talked repeatedly about, anyway, you walk into a restaurant, everybody's looking at their phones. I mean, it's like mind blowing, right? And it's
Do you know what we need to do? We need to bring back solidarity. We need to bring back community. We need to make people collectivist again. That's what's coming next. Solidarity means comrade. Ally means comrade. Solidarity means comrade. These kids just need community. They need to see themselves as part of the community. How about we try Marxism? Marxism will help them see themselves as part of the community. That capitalism made them so lonely. We can fix everything with more solidarity. Do you guys see the pattern? Once you memorize the 4 goals, you will recognize them everywhere. You have to be on the lookout for this pattern. Gain as much power as possible, destabilize the system, attack capitalism, usher in their Marxist utopia. The pattern is the same. It is perpetual. It is all these people do over and over and over and over again. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.
just something fundamentally wrong with the notion of communication, fundamentally wrong with the notion of embodiment, fundamentally wrong with respect for each other. It's fundamentally wrong with the inability to basically communicate in ways that are embodied. You look at, like, I have students come in and have earbuds in their ear. I said, I don't talk to you with the earbuds in your ears. I'm sorry. You're going to talk to me. You're going to look at me. I'm going to look in your eyes. We're going to look at each other. I want to talk to each other. But I'm not going to talk to you like that. I'm not going to do it. Oh, wow, I don't know. Or they bump into me in the corridor because they're not looking. They're looking at their phones. And I say, excuse me. I stop them. I'm nice. I'm not harsh. But I mean, I think pedagogy at its best is a rupturing force, even at the level of personal exchange, right? Should be a rupturing force, should be provocative in some ways. It should reshape how people are interacting with each other. I have to tell you, I have to leave in 10 minutes because we have guests coming, so I don't want to.
Many professors I interviewed, they complained about the fact that, back in the days, pre-internet, people were writing down their notes, and nowadays they have rows and rows of laptops they're facing. They don't see the faces of their students anymore. So
I don't blame. I'm careful about that because there's not a lot we're going to do about that technology. It's not going to go away. I'm sorry. So the real question here becomes, how do you fashion an educational system that in some way integrates that technology and humanizes it, so that it becomes an asset rather than a liability, right? So that all of a sudden, you have smaller classes, for instance, right? I mean, when I have a seminar with 15 kids, they're not going to be looking at their laptops playing all the time. But put them in a room of 500, and you're right. They're watching holiday events. They're somewhere else. I mean, I want to understand the conditions that produce that kind of indifference, emotional, visual, pedagogical. I mean, that to me is the underlying issue that we need to address. It's easy to be, how do you say it? It's easy to be distraught. Oh, look at these kids. They really aren't taking me seriously. That's easy. That's just a contempt. That's an expression of anger and contempt. I don't think that goes anywhere. And in the end, you deal with it by shaming kids. You say, you're stupid. What's wrong with you? Can't you watch me? What we really need to talk to with young people is, how do we make this education vibrant? So that you don't need a screen to watch when you should be talking to other young people around you and talking to me. How do you inject vibrancy into education and make it joyful? I mean, I would think that that's part of the issue.
Now the Dutch government introduced a new law for high schools and primary schools that we have to pay more attention to citizenship. We have to teach students about democracy and democratic values. And the funny thing is, back in the 60s or 50s, when you were in school, these classes weren't available. And yet your generation was very politically involved. So you don't need to have special citizenship classes in order to raise these critical, involved citizens. Somehow it happens
I think you need to use a different term. And I think the term is, what is the relationship between education and civic culture? And what kind of language and what kind of pedagogy do we want to organize to make it clear that, for instance, the social contract matters, that social responsibility matters, that we reject the neoliberal assumption that.
Did he just equate language and pedagogy? He said, what kind of language, what kind of pedagogy do we want? It seems to me like Henry is using the terms language and pedagogy interchangeably, which makes sense because one of the ways the left wins is they control the language. Did anyone else get that, or am I making that up?
Economic activity is divorced from social cost. That ethics is not worthwhile. I mean, if I talk about citizenship, I talk about citizenship, but I do it very differently than the way you're suggesting. It doesn't become a way of molding students. It becomes a way of encouraging a sense of agency that makes them critical and socially responsible. That's different. But when I talk about citizenship, I want to talk about three things, and then I want to add a different category. I want to talk about the relationship between political rights and personal rights, which we see a lot, right? But they don't have economic rights. You take away economic rights, those rights are bullshit. They don't mean anything to me. I mean, when you're poor and suffering, do I really care about voting?
No.
Do I really? No, it's nonsense, right? But the other thing is, the other end of this is that when we talk about questions of citizenship, this is not just about nationalism. It's about global citizenship. What's our responsibility as citizens of the world? How do we talk about our responsibility to the planet? How do we have a global ethic that basically suggests we have to have international institutions of exchange, monitoring social justice, making sure the planet can breathe, eliminating fascism? That's what matters to me.
Do you think the Sustainable Development Goals are a good start, or is that just a misleading?
I think there are two elements to think about with respect to that question. I think we should go right back to Andre Gortz and talk about what does it mean to have non-reformist reforms. And I think that what that means is that in the most immediate sense, anything that has something to say about the planet and social justice is in the most immediate sense. Notice what I say in the immediate sense. I'm for it. But I'm not for it if that substitutes an immediate need for a lack of understanding and a desire for long-term structural goals. If it doesn't, if it's not going to talk about getting rid of capitalism, I'm not for it.
Oh!
I understand the immediate sense. We have to think for.
Oh God, Henry, I love you, Henry. I do. Thank you, Henry, again. Thank you. I need to go back and clip that. Hang on. Henry, our new favorite guy. I might love Henry even more than I love Nick Fuentes. It's true. It's possible. I assure you. I know he's older, you know. Apparently I can't find any happy medium. It's either the 25-year-old fucking wannabe neo-Nazi or the 80-year-old socialist. Anyway.
Reforms. And I think that what that means is that in the most immediate sense, anything that has something to say about the planet and social justice is in the most immediate sense. Notice what I say in the immediate sense. I'm for it. But I'm not for it if that substitutes an immediate need for a lack of understanding and a desire for long-term structural goals. If it doesn't, if it's not going to talk about getting rid of capitalism, I'm not for it. I understand the immediate sense. We have to feed poor kids, right? I mean, I'm sorry. You don't throw them under the bus because, it's a capitalist society. But at the same time, I don't think charity, to say the least, as a long-term goal solves our problem, just makes it worse. And so we have to balance this understanding.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate you, Henry. I might even buy one of your books, Henry. I doubt I'll actually read it, but, I can dream. All right. I got my clip. We have about 2 minutes left of this. Javier he's in the top, he came in second, but now they're having a runoff, so he's in the top 2, and there's going to be another election on November 9th. People think there's cheating. I don't know. But we'll pray for Javier to come out on top. All right, let's wrap up this one, and then we have our next present. Don't go anywhere. We're watching one more with Henry after this, but it's going to be shorter than this.
So let's end this interview on a positive note. What's the most encouraging event you saw this year, which gives you the trust that things might change for the better?
I saw teachers mobilizing all over the world. I see young people in Iran fighting against incredible odds. I see people all of a sudden organizing against police violence. I see a new discourse emerging among people and intellectuals around trying to understand the various crises in which we find ourselves. I see unionizing going on, unlike we've seen before in the United States. And I see the possibility for openings that are truly able to recognize that social movements really have to emerge to fight what is probably the greatest crisis of of human history. I mean, when you talk about the planet dying, you don't come back from that. You know, it's not a meteor killing the dinosaurs and all of a sudden we sprout up again, right? That's not going to happen. I mean, a crisis always offers a sense of possibility. And my faith
That may
is
be
in young
true,
people.
Jenny.
They're the group I look to, not because I'm older, because I think they have the energy, they have the imagination, and they realize that they're a
Thank you for the
displaced
super chat.
population. They're outside in different categories, of course, some worse than others, but there's something going on collectively that speaks to what I call a global despair that is hard to ignore. And it's in that unwillingness to ignore it, I think that there's a possibility.
Henry, thank you very much for your time. You need to leave. And
Henry, we appreciate you, Henry. We appreciate you so much, in fact, that we're going to watch one more presentation from you today before we wrap up. So, guys, we just finished watching the presentation we started yesterday with Henry. We got one more great golden nugget right at the end. But what we're going to move into is about a half-hour presentation, so it's a little bit shorter. But I really wanted to go back to Pedagogy of the Oppressed because I really don't want to read it. And so if Henry can just explain to me what Pedagogy of the Oppressed says in his words, then that will save me the stress and anxiety that would be produced and annoyance that would be produced for if I actually had to read it myself. So we have this this video, and this is from January 31st, 2023. So this is this year. First published in 1970, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed is considered one of the foundational texts of critical pedagogy. Combining philosophical, political, and educational theories, and based on his own experience helping Brazilian adults to read and write, Freire's book is a powerful exploration of the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. As a reminder, colonizer means capitalism. Colonized means people being oppressed under the oppressive force of capitalism. Decolonization means taking back of the private property that the colonizers took and removing capitalism from it. Pedagogy of the Oppressed was a life-changing book for Henry Giroux. As he said in an interview, it gave me the language that enabled education to be understood as a political process. It is a book that changed the conception of what it means to work with people who were normally considered voiceless and understand that they do have a voice and can narrate themselves. This conversation with Giroux reflects upon the seismic impact of Freire's book, as well as its impact in our contemporary era in which neoliberalism means capitalism, has emerged not only as an economic model, but also a public pedagogy that permeates everything. Henry Giroux is one of the founding theorists of critical pedagogy in the United States. He is best known for his pioneering work in public pedagogy, cultural studies, youth studies, higher education, media studies, and critical theory. He currently holds the McMaster University Chair for Scholarship in the Public Interest in the Department of English and Cultural Studies. And this is about a half hour long, and we will hope and pray that Henry tells us more golden nuggets that we can then use to teach people what is really going on in public schools in this country. If you have not done so already, please do mount that like button for me. let's get this party started.
So thanks very much, Henry, for obviously joining me. And I have a whole number of questions I'd really like to explore with you today. And I guess, one of the first points I'd like to begin with, and I know you get quite embarrassed quite easily, but this is a quote I think I could equally apply to yourself when you once said that Paulo Freire was one of the most important educators of the 20th century. And I guess obviously I hold you in the same esteem as that. But what did you mean to convey when you said that about Paulo?
I think in many ways, Paulo shifted the paradigm around the relationship between education, democracy, and the possibility of basically taking seriously those people, those students, those workers, those who are considered the oppressed, to be able to narrate themselves and to understand education in a way that suggested it was eminently political and not just a method, not just an a priori script that you imposed on people. And so it opened up a lot of doors, theoretically, politically, socially, culturally, that in many ways, I think, spoke to my generation of young people. I mean, we were trying to find a language in which education was something more than about teaching for the test or standards or engaged in some kind of bureaucratic nightmare of what it meant to basically, define how education worked and what it was for. So in that sense, it was like a lightning strike. You read certain books and they shift the paradigm. I mean, he went far beyond Dewey. He went far beyond a whole range of liberal educators who were far more concerned about individual mobility than they were about social change. And so he, in a sense, provided a foundation that was taken up later by a whole range of movements that took it seriously, right? The movements in the 60s, the latter part of the 60s, the critical sociology movement in England and the United States, cultural studies, youth studies. I mean, all of these movements were vastly, in many ways, influenced by Paulo.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know obviously we've spoke about this at length before, but I think it'd be really interesting for the people listening today to, if you can explain a bit about how you, as a teacher, in high school, I believe, first encountered the work of Paulo and how you became good friends yourself, and how did that process happen?
Well, I was a high school teacher for about 7 years. That was basically my first foray into education. And at the time, I was teaching in the 60s. And I say this because in many ways, public education was a bit more open then than it is now in terms of the way it's being defined by teaching for the test or standards or learning outcomes, all this nonsense that basically.
What's funny is, so the first job that I ever had in higher education, for those who don't know, I worked in higher education for like 10 years at the beginning of my career. I kind of, there was part of me that really thought I was never going to leave, if I'm honest about it. But hang on, shit. Okay. I thought I screwed up my knitting. I was about to freak out. But so I worked at the first job I ever had was at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And at that time, and I was working in the communications office, and this was at a time when a lot of the professors at the Harvard Graduate School of Education were complaining about like having to like teach for the test. And at the time I kind of got it. And I was like, you know what? Some kids don't test well. And I thought that this was just like, well, some kids don't test well. Different people have different abilities, things like that. Looking back on it now, and looking at what's gone on in Portland or these places, like schools are getting rid of grades entirely. There is like the left has always had this tremendous backlash to any sort of standardized testing, and they always framed it in terms of like some kids are good at taking tests and some kids aren't, and we shouldn't just be teaching for the materials on the test. We should be teaching for everyone. I was kind of like, and I was on board with it up until schools started getting rid of grades and started saying, we don't really care if you can read or write. You can still graduate from high school even if you can't read or write because of your lived experience and that sort of thing. Is anyone else getting the sense that this whole pushback against standardized testing is like they don't want kids to learn? There is value in an uneducated, dumbed down population, there's value in making sure that we're completely discrediting every form of evaluation to see if kids are learning how to read, are learning how to write, are learning how to do math, are learning how to do all the basics, because they want to spend all their time teaching activism and social justice and equity and nonsense and bullshit and Marxism. Like, there's an incentive for them to be against standardized tests, because the standardized tests are not going to measure the areas that they want to be able to teach. Isn't that a mind fuck? This is like when I go back and I'm like, I have to reverse engineer every single thing I ever thought was true about the world. And I'm going to end up at the Holocaust at some point, and that scares the shit out of me. I'm not there yet. But I feel like this is where I'm at right now, where I'm like, let me reverse everything I knew about the world and really assess if what I think I know is the truth. I'm sure the Holocaust happened exactly like they said it did. I'm sure that I'm not going to find anything sketchy there at all, but I'm really avoiding going there just because the path that I'm going to get there is starting to scare the shit out of me, and I don't like it.
Depoliticize people and makes them stupid. And so I had more room, in a sense, to employ progressive methods. At that time, I was actually using films from from the Quakers, and using a whole range of books. I mean, I taught Wilhelm Reich's book on the mass psychology of fascism in high school. Think about that. And we had seminars. We did it in seminar forms with a whole range of students, working class kids who allegedly were more accelerated. And then one day I got challenged by a vice principal who basically believed that a militarized mind was the only way to really understand education in the rest of the world. And he was as offensive as he was aggressive. And he pulled me out of class and he said, "Why are you sitting like this?" And he was very upset, And to be honest, Brad, I identified with the experience, but I didn't have a language to basically articulate that in theoretical and political terms. And ironically, I came across very soon Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and it basically changed my life. I mean, it gave me a language, and it helped me to theorize much of what I was doing in ways that could be articulated to others, beyond the simple, "I like kids," or this feels right. I was no longer collapsing the political and the theoretical simply into the personal. And that was very important. Soon afterwards, I wrote to Paulo. I did a review, actually. Sorry, I did a review of one of his books, and he wrote to me. He sent me a letter that said, "I love this piece," and so forth. So I was just so overwhelmed. I mean, I was an assistant professor my first year at Boston University, and I get a letter from Paulo.
He worked at Boston
and we
University.
Began a conversation.
God
and
damn it!
From there, I met Paulo in 1980 when he was about to go back to Brazil after 18 years in exile. And we developed a long friendship. We developed a book series together, as you well know, on cultural studies, on culture and pedagogy. And we published about 86 people, many of whom didn't have tenure. And were trying to get tenure and couldn't get published. And yet their work was brilliant. But they were, they were.
Oh, great. Oh, great. I hate everyone. I don't hate you, philosophist. I don't hate you at all. I just don't know. I don't know that I want to know. Okay. I don't know that I want to know.
Ostracized because they were a little too left for the established publishers.
Well, what you described there is almost replicated in the world we're living in today. There's kind of no progress there. And I'm kind of thinking, the shift from Paulo's book to, I was, very fortunate to be invited to write the foreword to your latest book on pedagogy of resistance. And you kind of think, well, what's really changed, right, since that book comes out and your latest book comes out? And it seems that the struggles that you're identifying there are almost exactly the same struggles that we're facing today.
I think that actually they're worse today. I think the regression that has taken place with the collapse of neoliberalism and liberal democracy and the collapse of civic culture has so militarized this culture in the interest of a kind of burgeoning fascism, that one of the things that we've seen is an attack on education unlike, I think, anything I have seen in my lifetime. The banning of books, the claiming that historical consciousness doesn't matter, the embrace of rabid kind of anti-intellectualism, the move towards methods in a post-pandemic world. You and I have talked about this, where technology now has taken over in many ways the educational process. Let's all have a meeting and talk about Zoom all day and how it works. Never mind the alienation it produces in young people. And I think that in many ways, the power now has become so much more concentrated in.
I am absolutely not becoming a Holocaust denier. That's not happening. I'm not actually being sarcastic right now. I actually mean this. I currently absolutely believe that everything that was told to me is 100% factually true. I'm not being sarcastic. I know sometimes I use this voice and I'm being sarcastic. I'm not being sarcastic right now. I am absolutely convinced that everything I've ever been told is absolutely the truth. I'm just saying that I'm a little tired of having to reverse engineer every single thing that I know is true because people like to lie about what happened to serve their own political purposes. I'm just getting a little bit tired of it. I hope that when I do eventually end up almost inevitably examining that event, because it really just does seem inevitable now, I am sure that nothing that I find will be different than what I have been told happened. And I would say this is less about listening to Nick Fuentes, because Nick Fuentes isn't even talking about this stuff right now. I would say that my concern about what I might find if I eventually do look into this has less to do with anything I've heard Nick Fuentes say, because he's not really talking about it, and more to do with the reaction that I've seen from the conservative right over Israel. Because I've listened to Nick Fuentes for years shilling this stuff. You know this, Kino. And I never thought twice about it. Just dismissed it out of hand. Didn't think anything of it. Thought he was being crazy. Thought he was being provocative. Thought he was being a little shit on the internet for the sake of being a little shit on the internet. And then conservatives started losing their shit over Israel, have never been more passionate about anything in their lives than they are over Israel, started calling for the censorship of speech they disagree with after quite literally writing a whole book about why we shouldn't call for the censorship of speech we disagree with, Dave Rubin. And it just led to me asking some questions, is all. And I'm sure that those are just silly questions. I'm just a silly woman. I'm sure none of it's real. I'm sure that everything happened exactly like they said it did. I'm just saying that maybe at some point in the distant future, when I am mentally ready to go there, because I'm nowhere near that yet, maybe I'm going to look into it, and maybe I'm a little scared that about what I'm gonna find. But it's not because of Nick Fuentes. It's because of it. Some might say it's because of Jewish behavior that I'm afraid about what I'm going to find. Let's continue.
The hands of the right, because they're implementing policies that are so powerful that I don't think Paulo's work has ever been more important than it is now. Because he not only understood school as a site of struggle, He understood that in some fundamental way that questions of consciousness and questions of literacy were fundamental to notions of agency, in which young people had to learn something about the conditions that dominated their lives. And in doing that, that was the first step to not only recognizing those conditions, but recognizing the limit situations imposed on them. And so it seems to me that that was the first step in being able to gear a pedagogy that was really a social theory, a project, that was really about domination and how to recognize it within the educational process and within not only institutional schooling, but also in other areas, and where that went in terms of being able to fashion, and this is very crucial, people who are both informed and critical and at the same time engaged. He wasn't just talking about literacy as a form of critical thinking. He was talking about literacy as a form of praxis, as a form of critical consciousness. One conscientization, as he put it, meaning that you link what you knew to what it meant to actually intervene in the world. That's why those people who have argued that Paulo Freire's work is a methodology are completely wrong. It's not a methodology because it's concerned with questions of justice and power and agency. It's concerned with how knowledge is linked in some way to the conditions of labor. It's concerned with what it means to produce people who know how to desire and imagine the future in a particular way, but it's also concerned with the acquisition of agency and the struggle over agency. So he combined the symbolic and the material in ways that sort of say that merge Reich, Wilhelm Reich, Freud, and Erich Fromm with others in developing the notion of freedom, in which questions of education were central to politics.
Well, I think, I want to come back to this in a moment, Henry, because I think one of the things which I've been taken always by your work is how education is central to politics, and in question, especially, and I want to return back to this question of consciousness as well. But before we go on to that, is there a particular quote from the Pedagogy of the Oppressed that really stands out for you? Is there a particular section that you find?
Well, there's a quote that I like that is to go back to your original question, as a high school teacher, really moved me. And I'll read it to you. And it's one of my favorite quotes from Paulo. He says, I'm a teacher who stands up for what is right against what is indecent, who is in favor of freedom against authoritarianism, who is a supporter of authority against freedom with no limits, and who is a defender of democracy against the dictatorship of the right. I'm a teacher who favors the permanent struggle over every form of bigotry and against the economic determinism of individuals and social classes. I'm a teacher who rejects the present system of capitalism, responsible for the aberration of misery in the midst of plenty. I'm a teacher who's full of the spirit of hope, in spite of all the signs to the contrary. I'm a teacher who refuses the disillusionment that consumes and immobilizes. I'm a teacher proud of the beauty of my teaching practice, a fragile beauty.
I'm going to have to fucking read this book, aren't I? God damn it, I'm going to have to read this book.
That may disappear if I do not care for the struggle and knowledge that I ought to teach. If I do not struggle for the material conditions which my body will suffer from neglect, thus running the risk of becoming frustrated and ineffective, then I will no longer be the witness that I ought to be, no longer the tenacious fighter who may tire but who never gives up. I mean, I love that quote. The quote is so humble and yet moving. I mean, it combines the politics of critique with the politics of hope, with a very expansive notion of freedom. Freedom is not just about political and personal rights. It's also about economic rights. We don't have the material conditions in which to exercise a sense of agency, then rights disappear. If you're impoverished, as most people are in this neoliberal fascism that dominates the globe now,
that means capitalism.
When you can't even provide food for your children or for your family or for yourself, or health care, or any of the basic social provisions that make life basically worth living in some ways.
Yeah, well, I think the 3 points which really come out of that, Henry, and again, I sense, I know there are 3 points which are really integral to, all the, the wonderful books that you've produced is, in terms of this question of, what does it mean to be an ethical witness to history? And there's 3 points in there which you raise in that quote, which I think, as you've just mentioned again, it's the question of capitalism, or what we now call neoliberalism today. What does a pedagogy of hope look like?
It's a question of capitalism, or what we now call neoliberalism today. All right. Let me just go back a little bit. Always got to be on your toes. These people are tricky. It just can slide right by.
Really integral to, all the, the wonderful books that you've produced is, in terms of this question of, what does it mean to be an ethical witness to history? And there's 3 points in there which you raise in that quote, which I think, as you've just mentioned again, it's the question of
I apologize. I don't have the full thing on my screen. I need to go back again. Sorry. Queen Beth of the chat, thank you. Thanks for sharing your vulnerability, Carlin. I think that's what keeps a lot of us from delving deeper into contradictory information that we will discover we were mistaken. Well, like I said, I'm not doing it tomorrow or anything. Probably several years from now, when I am independently wealthy and I don't care if I get canceled off of everything and I don't need to rely on anyone else to make money. I mean, I don't really have to rely on people right now, except the good people who are kind enough to fund me. But I'm probably not going to go into the Holocaust stuff until I'm independently wealthy. And I know that I won't be canceled for anything that I happen to find. It's going to be many moons from now. And in the meantime, I appreciate your super chat, Beth. Thank you.
Living in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think the 3 points which really come out of that, Henry, and again, I sense, I know there are 3 points which are really integral to, all the, the wonderful books that you've produced is, in terms of this question of, what does it mean to be an ethical witness to history? And there's 3 points in there which you raise in that quote, which I think, as you've just mentioned again, it's the question of capitalism, or what we now call neoliberalism today. What does a pedagogy of hope look like in the face of that? And how does that?
All right. I got the clip I wanted. I'm sure we're going to get 7 or 8 other clips before this is done too. Hang on one sec. It's going to load. Make sure I got it. There it is. All right.
That really enrich material conditions, and those are the 3 points which I've always found completely central to the project that you have been developing. And I'm wondering whether you can elaborate a bit more on that kind of connection between capitalism, hope, and the materiality of the lived condition for humans today.
All right. I think in many ways, capitalism is wedded not to hope, but to despair and cynicism, and functions in a way through those processes to utterly depoliticize people. Capitalism operates off the assumption that the only problems that exist are basically individual problems. Mm-hmm. While at the same time, it basically concentrates wealth and power in the hands of a financial elite who spread misery all over the globe, including destroying the planet. Mm-hmm. And I think that what hope does, in the sense that Powell talks about it, is he talks about understanding the limits of the situation in which we're in. And what that suggests is that history is not determined, it's conditioned. And that we're agents, and that we live in a world that's unfinished. And as a result of that, we have to think very carefully about what our roles are to basically imagine a world that isn't marked by despair, that isn't marked by poverty, that isn't marked by massive degrees of inequality, that isn't marked by sexism, an attack on trans people.
How do they propose creating this perfect world that isn't marked by inequality or poverty or sexism or attacks on trans people? How do they believe that they will create this perfect world? The world right now is unfinished. Life is unfair. How do they propose making life fair and ridding us of all of these obvious social problems of inequity? That's the Marxist revolution. That's why they believe it's going to be the socialist utopia, because in the socialist utopia, they will have perfect equity, perfect sameness. They will have gotten rid of capitalism. Everything's going to be great. Exactly. That's what the Marxist utopia is.
Think very carefully about what our roles are to basically imagine a world that isn't marked by despair, that isn't marked by poverty, that isn't marked by massive degrees of inequality, that isn't marked by sexism, an attack on trans people, an attack on anybody who's not a white supremacist or a white nationalist these days. And I think that in this sense, you begin to.
Hang on. Enoch, welcome. I think you're new here because I don't recognize you. Do these people ever research other communist countries, or do they wave it off and says this isn't our socialism? That's literally what they do. Like we have watched presentations for Socialism Saturday. There have been entire books written about this idea that they do look into other socialist countries. They do look at the failings of they do look at the failings of socialism and communism previously, and then they quite literally say, we're going to do it different this time. Pinky swear, bro. Trust us. We promise. They've written entire books about this. They do entire trainings about it. So we're not going to convince these people that this is a bad idea based on history, because they know what the history is. They're very aware of it. They're not pulling the wool over their eyes. They just think it's going to be different this time.
Understand two things. One, that hope is an educational process, that you have to move people away from a sense of cynicism, which really depoliticizes them. Secondly, you have to recognize that neoliberalism basically normalizes itself by saying that hope doesn't exist, that everything is basically hopeless and there's no alternatives. And thirdly, I think in some fundamental way, and this is the most important for me, hope is not only an educational practice that has to be employed, it's not about simply individual salvation, it's about social change and collective struggle. This is what somebody else, another philosopher.
Henry literally defines hope as social change and collective struggle. Hope means collective struggle. Of course, we know struggle is code word for revolution, which means the perpetual revolution, the Marxist revolution that's going to lead to their perfect, equitable, amazing society in which life is completely fair for everyone. That is how Henry is defining the word hope. Doesn't that give us another perspective on the Barack Obama hope posters of 2008? Isn't that funny? Isn't that funny? They were saying the quiet part out loud right in front of us all along from the very beginning, and we never knew what they were saying because people weren't listening to them. This is why, guys, I know this is boring to sit through sometimes, I really do, but this is why it is so important that we sit down and listen to them, because we're quite literally the only non-socialists on the internet doing this that I know of. If other people are doing it, tell me who they are. Honestly, I would love to talk to them. But I don't know of anyone else doing this. So, how scary is that?
It's called social hope. You know, not simply the kind of hope that you associate with Disney or with neoliberal notions of meritocracy. That's all nonsense. I mean, it seems to me that in that way, you know, hope sort of focuses on the contradictions that exist in a society that separates people, makes them disappear, dehumanizes them, and raises fundamental questions about what the conditions are that do that, how they can be addressed, and what it means to address them collectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to then link this, you know, this question of also about the question of consciousness. And to me, when we talk about consciousness, and you know, you mentioned this before, that one of the things you thought was overlooked sometimes in Paolo's work is the importance of consciousness. And I'm wondering how this connects to your idea of the radical imagination. And I think one of the things that's been often, you know, said about what one of the crises of contemporary politics is a crisis of the imagination. And I'm wondering how you see that in terms of how might consciousness work better in terms of liberating the imagination in a more radical way, as you understand it.
I think that notion of liberation begins with the notion that we live in a world that's social and interconnected, and that you can't separate that notion of the social from matters of economic and social justice on a global scale. And I think that this question of consciousness, which is often downplayed, because I think the left is really utterly guilty in some ways of not making education central to politics and believing that domination is generally simply about institutional and economic structures and nothing else.
Wow.
There's very little concern.
The left is guilty of not making education central to politics. They are winning. They're so far ahead, it's not even funny, bro. I really wish people would stop saying there's no way they're going to win. Truth will prevail. We will prevail. Jesus will come down and save us all. No, bro, they're winning so badly, it's not even funny.
With how the individual basically is rooted in a way in which he or she can learn to understand, maybe through a different language, both the conditions under which they live and what it might mean to take charge of those conditions. I mean, domination is not just economic, it's also pedagogical. It's also rooted in questions of persuasion and belief and education. And I think until we begin to understand that, you can't attack a problem until you can understand it. And at the same time, this question of consciousness is now part of an educational ecosystem, so to speak. That's not just simply about institutional schooling. I mean,
so am I. They've been indoctrinating and dumbing down the entire American population for almost a century. Do you think it's any coincidence that test scores have consistently gone down? Do you think it's any coincidence that kids are getting dumber and dumber and dumber and dumber and dumber and dumber? Do you think it's any coincidence that they're becoming more inclined to be social justice activists than any other profession on the planet? Do you think this is any coincidence? It's not, because they've been programming the entire population for almost a century. We are going to reach a point in this country, and it's probably going to be around 20 years from now, in which the majority of the population will not know how to read. I'm going to say that again, because I want people to really understand this. There's going to come a point in this country, and it will probably happen within all of our lifetimes, in which the majority of the country does not know how to read. You think they haven't done that? That's exactly what they've done. That's exactly what they want. How do you get people to fight back? And by the way, the only people who are going to know how to read are going to be the intellectuals. And we know from this presentation that intellectual means Marxist. How are you going to overcome that?
Education now is a massive phenomenon, as C. Wright Mills, Gramsci, Zygmunt Bauman, you, and others have been pointing out for a long time, rooted in a whole range of cultural apparatuses.
Bro, you need to catch up real quick. Not knowing how to read does not equal individualism. Yes, it does. When you don't know how to read, you have no individual agency. You are at the whim of everyone around you. You need to rethink that, because that is one of the dumbest things that I've heard like all week so far. I know it's only Tuesday, but like the idea that not knowing how to read does not equal individualism. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. We're talking about overcoming a society built on individualism and meritocracy. How do you expect people to exist in a meritocratic environment if they don't know how to read, if they don't know how to write, if they don't know how to communicate, if they don't know how to do basic functions of existing as an adult in the world? You know who they're going to rely on? Mommy and daddy government to do it for them, which is exactly the point. They are giving up who they are as an individual to be assimilated into the collective of mommy and daddy government.
That basically are about colonizing consciousness. It's not just simply about consumerism and turning the obligations of citizenship simply into an act of consuming. It's about making people feel as if they don't count. It's about making people feel that they should disappear. It's about expanding, it seems to me, the notion of oppression to include far more groups than simply the working class. And I think that that's one of the things that Powell really understood. He understood that agency was central to politics. Modes of identification was central to politics. But maybe most importantly, that education was central to politics because we had to be able to understand, work with, teach, and side by side, organize with people for whom they could recognize what we were talking about and learn in terms of the lives that they led. So we had to become learners and not just teachers. You know, we had to work with people, not work on them. And I think this business of working with that rather than working on opens up a pedagogical space that's protective, that's fluid, that's safe, and profoundly radical. Because remember, for Paulo, hope was a function of what he called, as well as education, radical futurity.
Radical means socialist.
To imagine something different.
Socialist.
And I think that to go back to your question, I'm sorry this has been so long, but to go back to your question about the imagination, I want to talk about the civic imagination and the public imagination and how that gets undermined, how the question of shared values gets reduced to privatized values, how the question of hope gets reduced to individual salvation. And when that happens, civic society begins to collapse.
Wow.
The public imagination is no longer a radical imagination. It's a privatized imagination. It's a gated imagination. At the same time, if you don't have institutions that are public, that open the space for all of us as intellectuals, as workers, as cultural workers, as artists, as workers in general, to be able to in some way share our vision of a future in which humanity is lifted and expanded, something tragic happens. And what happens that's tragic is despair and death take over. And they take over in the form of fascism, which is rooted basically
Capitalism.
in hate, in greed, and bigotry, and notions of whiteness that really resembles something that we have seen in the United States, starting with slavery, and of course manifested itself in Nazi Germany and Pinochet's regime, among others.
Yeah. Well, I want to connect this also to the history of Latin America, because, you know, I recently watched this documentary on Margaret Thatcher. And the one thing that became very clear with Thatcher was, you know, she understood the pedagogy mattered, right? Ideas mattered for Thatcher, right?
Yes.
If you're going to be taught, you would be taught Hayek, you'd be taught Friedman.
Hayek got it. He got that.
You know, and I think, but I'm thinking then in terms of, you know, obviously with her connection with Pinochet is in itself is very interesting. You know, if you want to understand the violence of capitalism, of course, it starts in an authoritarian regime and that neoliberal guise. But I want to connect this more to the contemporary moment, and particularly, you know, I know what you've already said about what you understand the attack on critical race theory as being, and actually part of a broader attack on critical pedagogy more generally. Yes. And I'm wondering how this especially also connects to what's happening in Brazil, which I know you've also said what's happening there is an attack on the legacy of Paulo. And I'm wondering whether you can elaborate more on that.
No, right. I mean, I want to begin by pointing to two references here. One is, you know, the recent comparison between what happened in Brazil and what happened on January 6th. It is certainly worthwhile. But isn't it interesting that nobody talks about the fact that Bolsonaro's attack on education and Paulo and critical pedagogy in general is not unlike what is also happening in the United States. So that whole attack on consciousness and the possibility of people engaging in forms of pedagogy that are empowering sort of gets written right out of the script of comparisons, right? In some fundamental way. And I think, you know, for many people who don't really understand this, is that Paulo's pedagogy was really for the subaltern. It was for the global South, right? I mean, that's where it really takes hold. And in many ways, by not understanding that, we lose in some fundamental way, what it means to talk about education and hope that is rooted in a notion of the imagination that's collective and global. Global. I mean, because what Paulo understood immensely near the end of his life was that neoliberalism was a poison, and that democracy and capitalism were not the same thing. And that if you were really going to talk about enriching the public and civic imagination, you had to begin there. That he was not talking about education in the interest of reform. He was talking about in education in the interest of radical transformation, like Martin Luther King was.
Oh my
And he
God.
also understood that many of these problems that we talk about, these various forms of oppression, they intersected. They mutually reinforced.
Radical transformation means socialist transformation. Anytime you hear the term radical, you need to, unless you're talking to a Ninja Turtle or a surfer or something like that, like you need to think in terms of socialist.
Each other. He was looking to link education politically to a larger narrative, and that narrative was socialism, just as Martin Luther King was trying to do. And that often gets completely written out of his script. But there's a third thing, Brad, that I think we're both well aware of. I find it interesting that the attacks on critical pedagogy now are very similar to the attacks that Bolsonaro, in the language he used, that critical pedagogy is a form of communism, that, this is all Marxist dribble, right? That it's really about indoctrination. Can you imagine the people who are banning books and forcing teachers to sign loyalty oaths are talking about how education is neutral and how people who are progressives or on the left are promoting and indoctrinating people by trying to make them more critical and make them active, involved citizens who believe that any radical democracy doesn't exist without an informed citizen.
Socialist
the
democracy
is so overwhelming that it's really hard to believe. Somebody has said, well, what's the difference between optimism and hope? Well, hope is geared towards not only a collective struggle, it's geared towards radical transformation and not reform. Optimism is, okay, but it usually is, it sort of sides often in my terms on the side of Disney and on the side of individual kinds of, movements.
Yeah, well, and also, Henry, in terms of picking this up, and I think, one of the things I say, which I've always really admired with your work is you've taken Paulo's work and you've not only applied it to an entirely new historical conjuncture, but also you've taken it in far more, in different directions and applied it to different, circumstances. And I'm interested in basically, this question around instrumentalization of education and the dangers of that kind of, that instrumentalizing logic, which we see more and more, again, accelerating in the, education is just for jobs and there's that purely instrumental value to it, but also the speeding up through technology now that, that everything has to be imminent and immediate and quick, and how that is counterintuitive to the very kinds of rigor which critical pedagogy requires. And I wonder, one thing I've always been, in a complete...
Hang on. Curtis is asking another good question. When they define everything in terms of the lens of the oppressor or the oppressed, how do they see their utopia in the same lens? There's always a hierarchy in any system. Guys, is there going to be, and this is a pop quiz for the chat, is there going to be a hierarchy in the Marxist utopia? What are they going to instill in the Marxist utopia that is going to account for the hierarchy? Let me ask this a different way. Does equity in the mind of a socialist have the same hierarchy as capitalism has? Because the answer to this question is that the goal of implementing the Marxist utopia is to implement a society entirely built on equity. Equity means sameness. Everyone's the same. Everyone ends at the same place. In implementing a society based on equity, you get rid of the oppressor and the oppressed. Now, Will there be a hierarchy? Practically speaking, of course there'll be a hierarchy. We can look at things like 1984, either the book or the movie. You had the proles that were outside of the party. You had your party members, your average party members. Winston Smith in 1984 is just like an average party member. And then you had the inner party members who were like the head of everything. The inner party members were at the top of the hierarchy. The outer party members were like kind of like just the average people. And then you had your proles that were living outside of everything. Okay. So there was a hierarchy, but they don't acknowledge that in the implementation of their Marxist utopia because they believe that they're building a society based entirely on equity in which all disparity is removed from society and everyone has the same and no one is rich and no one is poor. Everyone has what they need. All their needs are provided by the government. They're going to eliminate all private property. So you will own nothing, but you'll be happy because the government is going to provide you with a place to live and the government's going to provide you with a universal basic income and the government's going to provide you with a job. You don't get to pick out what job you have, but you're going to have a job and you're not going to eat if you don't go to that job. And if you go to your job and you do what's required of you, then the government's going to provide you with food in the community kitchen. If you do a really good job, the government's going to provide you with kids because they're going to get rid of the nuclear family because the nuclear family upholds capitalism. So they have to get rid of that because capitalism is inequitable. And so they have to get rid of that because in capitalism, people end in different places and there's too many disparities. So they have to get rid of that. So they have to get rid of the nuclear family. But you're going to have all your needs you're going to have universal health care. The government's going to provide all your health care for you. The government's going to provide all education. Homeschooling will not be allowed, only public education. So they do believe that in building their society on equity, they are going to be getting rid of oppressor versus oppressed. Of course, that's not what's going to happen, but that's what they believe, and that's the important thing. Brooklyn Way on hierarchy, yes. Intersectionality narratives. Brooklyn, it's not going to have to do with intersectionality once they get their Marxist utopia. That's not, because they don't actually care about that. They don't care about that really at all. They believe, remember Brooklyn, they believe that when they get rid of capitalism, they're going to get rid of racism. They're going to get rid of the patriarchy. They're going to get rid of homophobia. They're going to get rid of transphobia. They think that all of these things, Henry just said it a minute ago, they think that all of these things are going to go away once we get rid of capitalism. Because remember, these people think that capitalism has created all of the problems in society. And so if you get rid of capitalism and you get rid of the profit motive, then all of these other things that they complain about all the time aren't going to exist anymore. Make sense? Thank you. Jenny's getting inky with it. It's what the first Matrix was based on and why it failed. They had to reintroduce meritocracy into the Matrix so people wouldn't reject it. And that's how it appears to me. I think that's a really good point, Jenny. Really good point.
Big admiration of your work is the attention to rigor and detail. And I'm wondering whether you can maybe offer a few comments and also advice maybe for people who are just beginning with critical pedagogy about the importance of rigor and, and against that instrumentalizing logic.
I mean, I think the last thing that we want to do is confuse what we do, those of us who are engaged in what allegedly might be called an empowering project of critical pedagogy, with the kind of instrumentalization that reduces pedagogy to questions of method, to methods of sterile pragmatism, to a kind of utterly barren reductionism. And basically in doing that, eliminates questions of power, questions of justice, questions of hope, questions of emancipation, and questions of freedom. I mean, I think, you and I share a certain position with Zygmunt Bauman, who wrote about instrumentalization in a way that far exceeds traditional works on the culture of positivism or on the politics of empiricism. I mean, this kind of technological rationality, it leads to the camps. Mm-hmm. It leads to the camp. I don't want to be too, pessimistic here, but it seems to me that as soon as you divorce educational theories, economic practices, social policies from questions of social cost, then you create a terrain in which questions of the ethical grammar of justice and social responsibility begin to disappear. And all of a sudden, you don't have a language any longer for understanding how deeply repressive and dogmatic this technocratic rationality actually is. This instrumentalism, it objectifies, it dehumanizes, it erases the voices of difference, and it makes justice look as something that's irreparably old and nostalgic because it can't be measured. And so it seems to me this is once again a very dangerous moment that has echoes of a past
I like
that
this.
Adorno and
This is good.
Horkheimer and Marcuse nailed. And we shouldn't have to repeat this, but we certainly.
No, Curtis. Homeschooling is not going to be allowed. They are going to try to ban homeschooling, and they're not going to wait that long for that. They're going to try to ban homeschooling like probably within the next 5 years. So no, you are absolutely incorrect that homeschooling will be allowed. Only public education will be allowed in their Marxist utopia, bro. There is no universe. There is no universe in which homeschooling is going to be allowed in their Marxist utopia. And they're not even going to wait that long. So I'm sorry. I really am sorry to break the news, but that's just not accurate.
Certainly shouldn't have to repeat this. And one of the most important civic institutions in the world, which is public and higher education. That's the last place that should be instrumentalized in the manner of the corporations, in the manner of global capitalism, in the manner of the financial elite, in the manner of neoliberal fascism. It seems to me it's a very dangerous move that eliminates an important public good from, in some way, offering both a critique and a sense of possibility for educating generations of people to be able to see beyond it and to question it.
Mm-hmm. Well, as always, Henry, it's just amazingly enlightening speaking with you. And I'm mindful that time has kind of run out already before we get on to questions. But there's one final question I think I'd like to ask you. And before we open up to other questions, and if you could have one more conversation with Paulo, what topic would it be with him about today?
Wow. That's what would I have talked about today? I think that what I would have been concerned about is how, in an age in which power and the new technologies have merged to create social formations pedagogically unlike anything we had ever imagined before. I think this question of the media and its sort of technological advances have really created a generation in many ways of young people who are not only tied to an image-based pedagogy, but are also tied to a culture of immediacy and privatization. And I recognize that there are all kinds of groups that use that technology in fundamental ways to offer modes of resistance and to connect with each other. But I think as a dominant paradigm, none of us could have imagined what it would have helped to put in place in terms of the dangers we're facing today. I would also like to have known what it would have meant to be able to talk to each other and to create an international movement for the preservation of public goods and socialist democracy. I think that our generation was too tied in some ways to national boundaries. We still hadn't figured out the importance of the fact that power had become global while politics had become local. That the global elite now don't care about nation states. They just care about profits. And I don't think we had anticipated enough the potential of the destruction of the planet and what that meant. And it would have been interesting to all of a sudden sit down and begin to bring people together from a variety of groups and to be able to make education central to the politics and what it meant. My friend Stanley Aronowitz started to do that before he died. He had an enormous number of insights about what that meant. But much of that generation has passed, and it's sad because we don't have a comprehensive politics anymore in the way we had with the Frankfurt School, the way we had with Paulo. I think the way we had with many of us who are older, who have been working in this field for a long time. I don't believe in fractured politics. I think it's deadly. And I think that there has to be a way. Paulo used to talk about unity and diversity, something that Angela Davis and others have been talking about for years. That needs to be rethought in light of the most impending dangers that we face today.
Well, guys, that was a good uplifting presentation. I'm feeling a little depressed right now. Can I just wrap this up by depressing everyone before I go grab some dinner and come back in an hour and a half and do my other show? I'm feeling a little depressed right now. Because we are so fucked. We are so fucked. We are so fucked. Which, of course, I've been saying for a while. Like, this is actually, like, not new information. But previous to the past 2 weeks, I thought the reason that we were fucked is because the left was focused and cohesive and had a vision and had about a 70-year head start on us in implementing that vision. And the right were a bunch of jokers who just didn't understand what was going on and were like, would rather infight over social issues than actually focus on defeating the left. But now I've learned in the past 2 weeks that it's actually much worse than that, because it's not just that the right are a bunch of jokers, it's that they don't fucking care. There is no way that we ever overcome where the left is at if conservatives are controlled by people who care more about what is going on in Israel than they do about what's going on in America, and they are blacklisting everyone who questions the wisdom of focusing all of our energy and attention and our money and our resources on holding up Israel, who, by the way, was supposed to have enough money and enough of a military to be able to defend itself. There is nothing that we can do because we don't have the numbers. The right has no idea. They have no idea about any of this. They have no idea. James Lindsay apparently has been screaming about this guy for a while. James Lindsay quite literally modeled the cover art on his book after this guy's books. Like, we know that no one on the right listens to me. We know that that's been true for a while. I betrayed them by becoming a libertarian. After all, I committed the cardinal sin of not becoming a fucking shill conservative that spoke their talking points all the time. But James Lindsay's been screaming about this guy for a while, and they're not listening to him either. I want everyone to really pay attention to the behavior of the people that you're listening to. Pay attention to how excited they are about Israel. Pay attention to their actions, not their words. I don't care how many times they've said, "We're America first." I don't care how many times they've said it. If they are much more excited about Israel than they are about what's going on in this country, then my recommendation, I'm not going to tell you what to do or anything, but my recommendation is that you block their ass and you stop watching them and you stop listening to them, because you cannot trust a thing that they say. Dave Rubin's shown us that. Dave Rubin has shown us that. And I say that as someone who I didn't just see Dave Rubin on the internet. I had conversations with Dave Rubin in private, and he was saying the same shilly things in private that he was on the internet, so much so that I believed him. But it was never real. It was all smoke screens. Now we are so fucked. And Dave Rubin is going, I just wonder when good people are going to fight back. Yeah. Yeah. Indeed. Yeah. All right. Well, another day, another depressing outcome. But the good news is that we're going to have fun in about 2 hours on my channel, because we're going to do Nothing Remotely Controversial with Joshua. The show must go on. Yo, if Scott Adams says that anti-socialism cannot be sold to the youth, well, then we're fucked. Then we're fucked. Like, by the way, everyone's been tagging me in stuff Scott Adams is doing. I can't see it because Scott Adams blocked me for no good reason. So please stop tagging me in stuff Scott Adams is doing, because I can't see it and I can't interact with it. And it sounds like he's trying to do something cool. Sadly, he doesn't want me seeing it. So, such as it is. And of course, he's not interested in any of this stuff either. But whatever. Anyway, I'm going to be back in a couple hours. We're going to do Nothing Remotely Controversial with Joshua. Philosophist says, thanks for not playing your fiddle, Dr. K. You're welcome, Philosophist. And then programming note for tomorrow, and I apologize to my community members, but tomorrow's community call is going to be canceled. And I wish this was happening later in the day, but they decided to schedule it at 1 p.m. Eastern time, or noon Central time, I guess. And we're going to do a Nick Fuentes, Alex Jones live debate watch party, because I really want to watch this. And so that's what we're going to do tomorrow. I apologize for the overlap with the community call. Not my schedule, not my circus, but I think it's going to be entertaining. And I want to hear what happens, and I want to see it live. And I think some of you want to see it live too. And, you know, if the world is going to hell in a handbasket, we may as well watch Nick Fuentes and Alex Jones arguing for a couple hours. All right, guys, that's all I have for right now. I'm going to go get some dinner, but take care, and I will see you guys at 9:30.